Shinjin, thank you for taking this on.
Sure, absolutely.
Very,
It's been
very helpful.
Actually been a lot of fun. So what I wanted to do today, because we've done a couple of talks kind of around this subject, and I wanted to wrap this up today before we move on to the next phase. So we're not going to be talking about a particular ancestry day, but more or less a particular period. And so this is going to be the last words on our pre-Bodhidharma China. What was happening prior to Bodhidharma's arrival in China, and what its effects on modern Zen Buddhism may be. And we've talked about this from a couple of angles. We talked about Bodhidharma, what may or may not have been true about him historically. And one of the things that a lot of historians posit was that he was actually Persian and not Indian. So he had come to China from Persia along the Silk Road. Another talk that we discussed, we talked about what was the state of Buddhism when he got there. I think we talked about that at the beginning of the summer. What would Bodhidharma have found? And so we brought up the concept of Taoism and how Hinduism is probably the bedrock of traditional Buddhism, but that Taoism may be more of the bedrock of Zen. And then we also talked about what might have been happening in a region of the Middle East called Bactria. Because one of the things that happened was after Alexander the Great destabilized the subcontinent of India, he made it ripe for the takeover of one person, and that one person was Oshaka the Great, who was a practicing Buddhist who sent Buddhist mercenaries throughout the rest of, not mercenaries, missionaries. Interesting, yeah, that was kind of
Freudian.
An Freudian slip. Well, yeah, we may delve into that later. But Bactria at that point was part of the kingdoms that he did conquer. And that actually, from most historians' perspectives, became the leading training center and university, for lack of a better word, of Buddhism up until sometime in the 6th century. And it makes so much more sense that Buddhism would have entered China via the Silk Road, which at the time was a lot easier to do than somebody getting from southern India directly to China, either by sea or over the Himalayas. So that kind of brings us up to where we're at now. What probably happened, or what might have happened during that period? Well, we know that prior to Bodhidharma, Taoism was very well established in China with very large temple structure and also hermits. So these were kind of the two modes that it was progressing in. And many of these hermits were actually revered as saints or even as poets. The best known of these guys come a little later. We have Han Shan from the 9th century, who wrote the Cold Mountain poems, that if you haven't read, I highly recommend it. They're really wonderful. We've done talks on just those poems before. And the Blue Cliff Record, which was codified in the 10th century, and it's attributed to a guy named Dahu Zhangao. And the Blue Cliff Record is really interesting because that is one of the sets of writing that Dogen brought back to Japan. They were considered kind of clarifications or illuminations of various koans. And so these are later going to become very important set of writings in the history of Zen, and we'll be talking about those down the road as we get to that period. However, if we push farther back in this tradition, all the way back to the early 400s, we found a guy named Hisai Ling Yu, and he wrote a very seminal work called Regarding the Source Ancestral. And one of the things that he states is that enlightenment is sudden and complete when it happens. And he had this concept, the Tranquil Mirror, it's all mystery and shadow, cannot include partial stages. And we know that the mirror is a very, very common motif in the history of Chan and Zen Buddhism. We have this precious samadhi mirror. We have mirrors mentioned in many of the sutras and many of the writings. But this is kind of the farthest back that anybody can find it. So here is kind of this beginning of this very Mahayana idea that enlightenment was going to be sudden and it was going to be complete, and also the beginnings of the idea here that it was available to anyone. And that's kind of a radical departure from Hinayana. And we know this is something every historian agrees on, that Mahayana never really caught on in the Indian subcontinent. It was kind of a small sect. It was a small group. It did not have a lot of influence. So somewhere outside of India is where this idea really took root and really flourished. And it's very likely, or at least possible, that Bactria, modern-day Afghanistan, is where this idea really took root and was then brought into China. But when it gets to China, it comes in contact with the existing Taoist thoughts, the existing Taoist structure of temples. You could almost call it the Taoist infrastructure of both these hermits and these large temple complexes. And now there's a really wonderful book by Red Pine where he went to find as many of these hermits that are still living in rural China, and asked them, could they explain the difference between Buddhism and Taoism? And to this day, these hermits responded with, it's the same path. It's the same thing. So, this kind of interlocking between the two sets of ideas apparently has been there since the beginning. And I'm not going to get too deep into the Tao, but I'm going to cover a couple of concepts so we can see how it fits in with what we conceive of as modern Zen. And the fundamental concept of the Tao is you have two opposing forces, concepts, ideas, whatever you would want to call them, and it's presence versus absence. And one of the ways that that's also translated is matter versus a life force. And the life force is referred to as absence. And there's a really great quote, all beneath heaven, the 10,000 things, it's all born of presence, and presence is born of absence. So that in a way, they're two aspects of the same thing. But you have the material world that we see, objects, ourselves, from a certain perspective, all the statuary, everything around us, but there is a life force underneath it that connects all things. So you have this matter versus energy. And in a way, that sounds a lot to me like relativity. So you kind of have two aspects of the same thing, presence and absence. And how we go from this concept of absence to the later concept of emptiness, as described in the Heart Sutra, I think there's some connection there. But we will save that one for a later date. But one of the things when I was researching this talk that I came across was a sutra that I'd never read before, and very interesting sutra, the Mahayana Maha Peri Nirvana Sutra. And this, the earliest known fragments are from the Andhra region of India, and somewhere between 50 and 130 AD, this sutra started to be compiled. However, these Indian versions are very short, and their only existent fragments are very short. There's all indication to think that these were ideas that were not developed very much farther in India. However, the Chinese versions, they start showing up in the early 400s. And so you have northern versions somewhere between 416, 418, and you have southern versions, and the southern versions are more widely accepted. And they were translated, and I put translated in quotation marks for a reason. And they're translated by a guy named Dharmak Sima, somewhere between 420 and 430. And if you look at the English versions, you can find them online, they're about 400 pages long. Okay, so it underwent a lot of revision between these original Indian versions and the Chinese versions that showed up later. So why would 421 be an important date? Because it predates Bodhidharma by almost 100 years. Okay, so what we've got is before Bodhidharma taught, before he got to China, there was already a very, very complex and wide-ranging sutra that had been codified in China. And one of the reasons I put translation in quotation marks, the historian and translator David Hinton described an incredible difficulty in translating from Sanskrit to Chinese. He said it virtually can't be done. For one reason, you've got a language that uses an alphabet going to a language that uses pictograms. And he said that just doing that, it like renders a lot of these Sanskrit ideas completely illegible. And one of the examples that he gave is if you try to translate Tathagata, sorry, I got tongue-tied there. If you try to translate Tathagata into classical Chinese, you come up with a word something like second-level tissue. And that kind of doesn't really mean a whole lot. Just to kind of as a side, does everybody, I don't know how many of you guys followed this news story about 20 years ago. Coca-Cola tried to operate in China, and it was a massive flop. Nobody would touch the stuff until somebody clued them in that Coca-Cola in Mandarin Chinese translates to bite the wax tadpole. So you probably had a lot of Sanskrit ideas that were suffering from the same fate. And another thing to keep in mind is that in Chinese, all words function both as a verb and a noun. So getting these ideas across directly from Sanskrit to Chinese would have been extraordinarily difficult and may not even happen. So that's another reason I think these possible Persian antecedents or Persian intermediaries might be so interesting. So a little bit about this sutra. The title, Maha, and in some titles it's actually referred to as the Mahayana Maha Pari Nirvana Sutra. So it's saying this is part of the Mahayana school, which we know didn't flourish in India, but became the basis for Shan Buddhism in China. So the Maha Pari Nirvana Sutra, Pari Nirvana is a particular aspect of nirvana that means nirvana after death, or the final death after the final birth. So we know that that's something that only a Buddha is going to go through. And in this case, the historical Buddha, Gautama Siddhartha. So what's the storyline of this sutra? Well, the Buddha himself is dying, and crowds have gathered to listen to his final Dharma talk. And so this account of his death is very different from the other accounts that we've been given. They say that 80 billion monks and arhats had gathered to pay tribute to the Buddha one last time. 80 million, that's a lot. The population of the world right now is somewhere around 7 million. So this is
billion.
What's it?
Billion.
Billion, yeah. 7 billion. So we've got 80 billion monks and arhats that have gathered. And the Buddha is presented with gifts from various groups. They all like line up. They walk around the Buddha 100 times. They offer the gifts, and in each case, the Buddha refuses them. So this group, and it ranges from groups of gods and goddesses to groups of royal families, to groups of monks, and the Buddha consistently refuses the gifts. And so these people are saddened, and they take a seat to one side. And these gifts were incredibly extravagant. There's one group brought him 84,000 elephants. Another made banners that were miles and miles long out of the most rarefied materials, silk and gold thread and things like that. But he kept saying no. One of the guys that I thought was the most interesting that showed up, he's only described in one line, but his name was Wonderful Sound. and he is referred to as the king of bees. And so the king of bees had come to pay his last respects. When it gets to the list of Buddhist sages that were there, one really interesting thing happens, and they are listed in their absence. It actually says, the Synod actually says, Mahakassapa and Ananda weren't there. So we get 80 billion entities to come bid goodbye to the Buddha, and the first and second Indian patriarchs are not there. So that's really interesting. But we know that there's another mythology that actually said that Mahakassapa missed the Buddha's death because he was off teaching in another part of India. So there is a kind of interesting connection to the Indian traditions there. But also that whole story kind of reads to me is very, very Indian. You know, as you look at the history of Chan Buddhism, you look at the latest sutras, you don't see these ornate, flourishing, crazy descriptions and 80 billion, you know, and these, you know, these ornate gifts. That all reads much more Indian to me than it does Chinese, and certainly than it does Japanese. But what happened after everybody took their place, and this whole section goes on for about 50 pages of who showed up to pay tribute. After the tribute, and all the tributes were refused, light issued from the Buddha, illuminating this entire congregation. Then the light returned to the Buddha, leaving the world temporarily in darkness. And this was interpreted to mean that the Buddha's mission was complete, that he was ready to leave the world, ready to leave samsara, and ready to leave the cycle of rebirth. So that's very interesting, and that's where we get this title, Peri Nirvana. So what is in this sutra, and what makes it different from any of the other sutras, and why, you know, obviously we don't do much with this sutra here. It's the first, I've been here 27 years. It's the first I've heard of it. So what's interesting about this sutra? And it's got 8 central ideas, and it's divided up into those sections after we go through this really florid introduction. But the Buddhist talks about what exactly is a Buddha. And he says that the Buddha's body is indestructible and immutable even after death. And as we know, we travel all over India. I mean, India, the rest of Asia, Thailand, wherever you want to go, and there are allegedly pieces of the Buddha's body scattered all over Asia. I went to one place in Thailand that purported to have a piece of his cheekbone. Things like that. You know, certain temples have locks of his hair or pieces of his teeth. So, you know, that's kind of another interesting way to look at that there would be, you know, pieces of the Buddha everywhere you went in Asia, because his body was indestructible. Personally, I think it's more of a metaphor for his teachings. That's what's indestructible. But that's how we can look at, quote unquote, the body of a Buddha. So what is Buddha nature? And in this sutra, he said it is prevalent in all things. All things possess Buddha nature, and only by observing the precepts can one see it. When one sees it, one attains complete, unsurpassed enlightenment. That to me it sounds really like an echo from the Heart Sutra. So one of the things this sutra has been described is as the birth of Chan. So here we start seeing this radically different idea that Buddha nature was in everything. Everything had the potential to become a Buddha. So it's this radical departure from the Hinayana teachings. And this may be one of the first places that this was actually codified, or at least the first place that is accessible to us as modern-day Zen Buddhists. And remember, this is also the conundrum that drove Dogen crazy. This is the conundrum that drove him to China. When his teacher said, go to China and figure this out. They didn't say go to India and figure this out. They said go to China. So that's a really interesting distinction. And this is one of the first places that I've found in the study of history where this concept shows up. Okay, so the next thing he talked about was what is nirvana? And he just said, well, there's nothing to supersede it. It's not like anything else, and it is eternal. So we get the description of nirvana, and that it also is available to anyone that's willing to do the work, and there's really nothing else quite like it. And he was also asked, what ultimately is reality? And his answer was, your own true self is a force of absence. And our original nature is absence. So I think there's a lot of different ways to interpret that and look at that, but kind of tying it in to what we know of the Buddha's teaching, tying it into what we know of Zen, we're looking at the self and the self of no self. And one way you could look at that is you are, at your core, your original self, your true self, you are in tune with the forces of the universe. However, you're also wearing this suit of self, of non-original self, that is falling prey to the three poisons of hate, greed, and delusion. So this is an idea that is kind of showing up here, or being codified by a Chinese Taoist mindset, that we are stuck in this physical world, but we still have a core that's attuned with the chi, with the absence, with the life force. And it's this outer self, this outer personality, that is tripping us up. So very, very complex idea. But the next question he was asked was, do living beings have a self? And he said, the nature of the self is nothing other than the hidden storehouse of the Tathagata. So I think that, once again, there's a lot of ways to interpret that, but one of them definitely being is, the storehouse of the Tathagata. It's already inside you. This Buddhahood is already in there. And you can tap into it by your practice. So that's a very esoteric idea. And he was asking, then he asked later, what disposition should we adopt? How do we do this? And he says kindness, compassion, empathy, equal treatment of all beings. Basically what he says is the paramitas. I think that this section here is just an illumination of the paramitas. Those are the states that we need to strive for in order to get to this state of enlightenment. And he was asked, well, why should we have faith? Why have faith? What's that going to do for us? And I thought his answer was really good. He said, because the vast majority of people listening to the Dharma don't understand it. And if you don't understand it and you just abandon it, you've committed the sin of not completing the work, or not even starting the work. And so here's this implication that it is knowable. It's just a lot of work. But we have to have faith that what the Buddha taught us is correct and true, until the point where we actually understand it and actually live it. But in between those 2 points, we're stuck having to have faith that this is possible to get through, that this is possible to work out. And I think that's one of the vows that we take every time we take the vows. I vow to enter all Dharma gates. I think this is what that means. Okay, and then the last thing he talked about was eating meat. And so here is where we diverge from a lot of the other Buddhist teaching. It says you should regard an offering of meat. Keep in mind, these were monks that lived off of offerings. And we've been taught from a lot of traditions that, you eat whatever's put in front of you. Even the Dalai Lama said, I prefer vegetarian, but if meat's put in front of me as an offering, that's what I'll eat. In this sutra, he says, you should regard an offering of meat as the flesh of your own son. Okay, that's pretty straightforward. So he's saying you do not eat meat. To practice the path of Buddhism, you're a vegetarian. And that's the only place I know of where this is written out that way. So what does this all mean? How do we pull this together and move on to the next phase? First thing that occurs to me, Bodhidharma arrives in China, says to his successor, everything you need to know is in the Lankavatara Sutra, a different sutra than this one. Another sutra that exists in the Indian tradition only in small fragments, but by the time it's introduced into China, is several hundred pages long and very complex and complete. Okay, so something happened between what was taught in India and Bodhidharma's arrival, and I think with the Mahapani Nirvana Sutra, it may have happened more than once. And like I mentioned, the description of the Buddha and the events, they read very, very Indian. 80 billion monks, 80,000 elephants, banners miles long, witches, and all these florid descriptions. The other thing that happens with the language in that first part of the sutra is it repeats phrases over and over again. At the end of each one of these stanzas, it says, the Buddha refused the gifts, they were saddened, they took their seat at the proper place. And there's a lot of mnemonics like that. So from that, I think we can extrapolate, since most of these sutras were spoken and recited for hundreds of years. They estimate about 400 years before any of this was written down. I think what we're seeing is the remnants of those mnemonic devices for memorizing these as chants. So this may be an actual link to the original Indian teachings, those descriptions, and the use of those mnemonic devices. Because by the time we get to what we can call the big three in Zen Buddhism, the big three sutras, the ones that we deal with and read and study here on a really regular basis, the Diamond Sutra, the Heart Sutra, and the Platform Sutra, you don't see those mnemonic devices in use anymore. You don't see repeated phrases, thus I have heard, thus I would, but you see it here. So maybe an adaptation and continuation of an older practice. Another thing that I think that's really interesting, as I mentioned just a minute ago, the Lankavatara Sutra and the Pari Nirvana Sutra, and their Indian sources for like 50 to 200 AD in that range, they only exist in India as very short fragments. Fast forward 300 years to India, they're both hundreds of pages long. China, excuse me, from India to China, and they're both hundreds of pages long. So this idea that they were translated from the original Sanskrit into Chinese is probably not historically accurate. What probably happened is these fragments were adapted into much longer texts that had much more of a Taoist influence and a Taoist mindset than the original Indian. So a couple of ways to look at this. What's the likelihood of Buddhism going straight from India to China? Not very likely. From a lot of historical perspectives, very hard to get to. The easiest way to get into China at the time was the Silk Road. And we know that we had huge Buddhist systems, complexes, temple complexes, hundreds of thousands of monks and priests in the Bactrian region, which is a direct shot into China on the Silk Road. Our historically most well-known and most important of these teachers being Bodhidharma, being described as Persian. So that's one interesting thing. And from there, you get this philosophical shift in the teachings, and the Chan Buddhism, Zen Buddhism in the Japanese, is primarily based on a lot of Taoist ideas. Primarily this idea of the original self that's in time with the flow of the cosmos. And the self is, there's this deeper self that's in flow of the cosmos, being a very Taoist idea that shows up slightly transmuted, but still shows up in the Zen ideas. To study the self, to forget the self, to forget this outer layer of conceived self that's under the influence of the three poisons. I think one of the ways we can look at this Chinese period, it's typically thought of as almost like a pre-Bodhidharma period and a post-Bodhidharma period. I think philosophically the more accurate way to look at it is pre and post Huining. And because after Huining is when we start seeing modern copies of the three primary sutras in Chan Buddhism starting to show up. From the 700s to the 900s, that's when we get the codification of what I'm calling the big three: the diamond, the heart, and the platform sutras. Obviously, since the platform sutra is about Huining, it would not be written before he existed, but after Huining taught and Huining was patriarch, that's when you start seeing the oldest known copies of the Heart and the Diamond Sutra. So I think that's kind of the way to look at this history. And we also know that Huining taught from a very large temple that had a permanent staff and a permanent kitchen and things like that. So once again, we're seeing a difference between this earlier period of wandering itinerant monks. So I think that's another influence of Taoism. So I think that's going to conclude this is, I think, the third talk on this early Chinese period. But I think that the extremely interesting period in Buddhist history, and set up what was going to happen in the future as we look at this more codified, more regimented post-Huining period. And we'll take a look at that next month. So what I'd like to do now is just open the floor to your questions and comments.
Just a couple of quick ones to follow on that. The last stanza of Hakuin's Song of Zazen is, what is there outside us? What is there we lack? Nirvana is openly shown to our eyes. This earth where we stand is the pure lotus land, and this very body, the body of Buddha. I think that's one of the ways we interpret this indestructible body of Buddha. It's us. Everything and every body that is reborn is the body of Buddha. And just a sort of a plug for the podcast. In December, the last podcast will be a trio, 3 commentaries on Matsuoka Roshi's Janayana. Janayana means something like finding your way in the ways of jhana. And he does something much briefer than what Shinjin has just recapped for us, but he goes through those Chinese periods and shows their relevance to our time and to Dogen. And of course, he's basically recommending Soto Zen practice as the upaya of our times. But it dovetails very nicely with what you're saying. And I think we could think of absence, presence, absence.
Presence and absence, yeah.
You could say to yourself, well, what is present? You know, and you could say, well, these columns are present, the statuary and so forth, as Shinjin was pointing out. Everything is present. These are things that I register as being present. So what is Buddha nature absent? How is Buddha nature absent? So you could say it's absent of the dual nature of these things which we regard as present. Another word that is sometimes used is without. It said Buddha nature is without. It doesn't mean without as opposed to within. It's not a spatial thing. It's like Buddha nature is without attribute. Buddha nature is without definition, etc. So I think absence is one of those words that's kind of like without.
Yeah, I kept coming back to this concept of absence wearing a presence suit, of the original self wearing a suit of this outer self. That's kind of the metaphor that I kept coming back to.
Tsuki, can you take over? You need to move up here? To do that?
I should be okay. The wires are a little bit short. All right, everybody. I've got y'all in gallery, so feel free to make any comments or questions on my ball on the screen, and I'll call on anybody who has any questions. We may start with the Zendo if nobody has an immediate question, but I'll open it in applause for. No questions at this moment from the Zendo. I'm not. Okay, sorry about that. No questions from the Zendo. Does anybody have a question currently on the Zoom audience?
I see Kosetsu, Angan, Katsuryu, John, Hinman, Buddy, and Corolla. Hey, Jim.
Kosetsu has his hand up.
Oh, yep. Go ahead, Kosetsu.
So thank you for the talk. In listening to your descriptions about the different language between Sanskrit and Chan writings, things like that, what struck me was that what resonates with me so much, I think, is very often that Taoist influence that you talked about, the poetry of Cold Mountain and things like that. And I love reading the Taoist writings. And the core teachings resonate with me, but it's after it's been marinated in that Taoist soup for a while, I think is what really makes it so much more resonant for me. I think that is, at least for me, that's kind of an underappreciated influence in the Zen that has been handed down to us. So thank you for clarifying that a little bit.
Sure. Yeah, and one of the things that I kept coming up with when I was researching this a few talks back, talking about what may have happened in Afghanistan, was that you may have had a lot of influence from Hellenism, from the Seleucid Greeks that stayed in control of that region, until Ashoka the Great took it over. And there may have been Greek philosophers and teachers that also were in contact with Buddhist philosophers and teachers. So that's yet another layer of possible influence that may have happened.
I wanted to follow on that, John, just a second. In the commentary I'm making around Sensei, he talks about all the different Chinese teachers and how they were creative and innovative, and they taught in all different ways. And one of my comments was Socrates was not the only one innovating teaching methods at the time. But it looks like John Hinman. It looks like John Hinman. Doesn't sound like John Hinman yet.
Go ahead, John. You're muted. Oh, you're good.
First, thank you for the talk. I found it extremely interesting and engaging. What comes up for me as I sit here and, to use that word again, marinate in this space is this questioning, and I'm doing this almost rhetorically. I do want responses, please, but questioning the study of the Zen Buddhist history, the influences, the teachings, and where that questioning seems to be coming from is that that statement, if you meet the Buddha on the road, kill him, and question everything, and sitting in some place of direct experience, getting the teaching non-verbally, non-conceptually, allowing the universe and nature to be the powerful teacher that it is. I'll stop there, and I just ask you for.
Well, what I would say to that, and you remember Dogen said, enlightenment is like a huge house or a huge building with a lot of windows and a lot of doors, and that the direct experience you just described, sitting, is the front door. And the way I look at it is, sure, that's the front door, but does that mean that we ignore all of these other doors and windows? And I don't think we should. I think that the intellectual study of it has a lot of value. I don't think it replaces direct method. You got to look at it this way. We sit. If you were at every sitting session during a week, you'd be here sitting for about 30 hours or so. We talked about history for 45 minutes. So I think if we said all we're going to do is talk about Buddhist history, you can go take a class at Emory on that. You don't need to be here. You don't need to practice. But we're going to spend the most of our time sitting. But here's another thing you can think about. Here's another side door that may have some value. So, yeah, I can see a point if studying history was all we did, but to do it as kind of a footnote for seeking the direct experience, I personally see a lot of value in it. The other thing that I think happens is direct experience of enlightenment does not occur without a lot of prep, and that prep can manifest itself in several ways. One of them is a lot of sitting and a lot of practice. Another one is getting the mind intellectually ready to handle the event of enlightenment. And I think one of the ways to do that is ancestor study. We can look at what they did. What did they go through? What was Huineng's life like? What was Bodhidharma's life like? And I think those are different ways that we can prime the pump of our intellect to make it ready for direct experience.
So you want to come back on that, John?
I'm wondering how that lands with you, Sensei, as well as some of the others.
Well, Mike is a musician. I'm an amateur musician. Mike is very professional. And I think it has something to, an analogy would be theory as opposed to, just improvisation or playing. A lot of young musicians don't want to learn theory because they think it's going to hamper their creativity.
Right.
And it's probably true that, just give them a piano, let them sit, or a guitar, and let them play. They'll get to the point where they want to start digging into the theory, because they'll start seeing their limitations, unless they're Mozart, right?
Yeah.
Then, so I think you could speak around perhaps looking at practice as we mean zazen,
Sure.
and theory as you would look at playing an instrument and the theory behind the music.
Sure. I mean,
The relationship.
If you're playing with other musicians and they change key or they change mode, which mode of the major scale the piece is in, and they change time signatures, if you haven't practiced those time signatures and those modes, you're not going to be able to keep up. You're going to get lost. And, there is a certain amount of intuition involved there. I remember one guy saying he didn't understand the modes and he didn't understand time signatures that he couldn't feel, but he had to think about. And I said, give me an example. He goes, okay, 6/8 time and Dorian mode. And I thought for a minute, I said, well, Norwegian Wood by the Beatles? He goes, yeah, that's easy. I said, that's Dorian mode, 6/8 time. And, but I think it's a little like that, because for one thing, I think on one hand, your enlightenment is your enlightenment. Hojo's enlightenment is Hojo's enlightenment. Bodhidharma's enlightenment was Bodhidharma's enlightenment. But at the same time, it's all enlightenment to the same thing. And I think that was one of the things that Dogen was trying to say, a big building with lots of doors and windows. I don't think that study is a replacement for the direct experience, but I do think it can help you be ready for the direct experience.
Now, John, I think our priorities on the three-legged stool are pretty clear. Buddha practice on the cushion meditation comes first, Dharma second, and complementary to each other, and Sangha third. But from a skillful means perspective, and Sensei gets into this quite a bit too in his essay, teachers teach using whatever kit of tools they have. And one of the things we can use to bridge gaps between our perspective on practice and students, this happens all the time in my online Dokusan, is by referral to the history and referral to a given teacher's biography and things of that nature. So it's what I mentioned in the original Frontiers. It's a little bit like the documentation for an application on the computer. If you're not using the application, the documentation, workarounds, and so forth that you have it used to be printed, it's now all basically online, doesn't mean anything. But if you're using the application, meditation, then referring to, you run into a glitch or a problem, referring to written testimony from the ancestors, or working with a live teacher, is equivalent to Geek Squad, is can help you get over some of the humps and continue. But definitely a far second from direct experience. That makes sense?
Yes, thank you.
There's an old line in one of the Chinese poems that says, to move in the one way, Taoism, to move in the one way, do not neglect even the world of senses and ideas. Indeed, accepting them fully is identical to true enlightenment. And that was from Xing Xing Ming, the first Chinese poem we have that I know of from the history of Zen in China. So right from the get-go in China, there was no anti-intellectual bias. Taoism is actually very intellectual.
Extremely intellectual.
Think about it.
I think Bill had put his hand up.
Angan, did you raise your hand? Or Katsuryu?
The other Bill. Good
Okay.
morning.
Morning.
I don't know which Bill. The one thing that strikes me that's been said here, and it would be kind of ironic with at least my misunderstanding, always trying to, this word emptiness, or the language we're left with around emptiness or the absolute. It always has kind of a connotation, still has a connotation for me of being like the void. And earlier, Hojo, you'd mentioned it's absence of duality, not absence. And that helps me to, kind of see it more in, I don't know, less nihilistic terms. I'll just say that for now.
Yeah. Ajun can speak to this more clearly than I can, but when you look at energy and matter as a dyad in physics, as I understand it, matter is impounded energy. That is, it's enthralled to, the electrons enthralled to the nucleus and so forth, and molecules are captured by each other in some sort of an embrace of the four fundamental forces. But you can visualize energy that is more radiant and freer, like cosmic particles moving through the universe. They're still, according to my understanding, moving through what's called a geodesic, or curve, that is sort of the sum total of all the forces around them. So there's no actual separation, but you can conceive of energy as being radiant and, say, liberated from bondage by being impounded into matter. So similarly, I think we can look at the idea of emptiness as being extremely full. It's full of energy, just as I understand, and again, Carl or Adrian can speak more clearly on this. Particles can be considered virtual. They arise and disappear out of so-called the void. There is no such thing as void. Void is energetic. And similarly, I think we want to think of shunyata, or emptiness, as the field in which everything can happen, but it's an energetic field. And it's not form in the sense of impounded material in the form of a tree or column or a chair or a bench or a human being or whatever. But it is inherent in all form. So when you say form or emptiness, you're really saying the same thing. You're saying two different sides of the same coin. Appearance, how it appears, is what we call form, and we're familiar with that. And that's what we call presence. And then what we don't apprehend directly, although we're actually experiencing it all times, is the energetic movement. Mountains are always walking, and so forth. Everything is there's particle decay. Everything is changing in ways that we cannot perceive. It's not an object of perception. But we know from indirect sources that it's happening. So I think the great masters, India and China, intuited this. They had an intuitive grasp of this. That if anything is impermanent, as obviously the witness of everything you see when autumn leaves come, for instance, then everything must be changing. But maybe on different frequencies, like a polyrhythm, it's something we cannot perceive. So emptiness is as Nagarjuna said, seeing into the flux, F-L-U-X, flux, of arising, abiding, changing, and decaying. Flux is constant change. So he said enlightenment was seeing into that.
Thank you. And I want to thank Shinjin for the thorough presentation. It was very helpful to get a modern, a more up-to-date outlook. I've read some of the same fragments and Andy Ferguson's book as well. I'm wondering, Shinjin, another couple of books that you found to be particularly helpful.
Yeah, the historian that I mentioned, David Hinton. Yeah, he has a book called China Root that I thought was really helpful putting this talk together, and really helpful on these ideas. There's China's Zen, the one that you mentioned, China's Zen History.
Ferguson's book is called Zen's Chinese
History. Yeah.
Heritage.
Yeah.
And the Dumoulin histories are interesting. They're in two different, at least a set. I don't have a set, but I have two different volumes. I think it's India, China, and then the second one I think is all Japan.
Yeah. If
I remember correctly. They throw a lot of cold water on your mythology.
Yeah.
Which is healthy.
And I think that our mythology is all of this took place in India, and then Bodhidharma walked into this wild land of China with a radically new idea. I think that's the mythology, and I just don't think that's what historically took place. Thank you.
Bojo and Shinjin Sensei, I actually have a question.
Good. Tsuki has a question.
Testing, testing. Okay. So this is both maybe like a theological question, but also a historical question. I was reading an undated fascicle by Dogen, where the entire fascicle is his fervent criticism against Lao Tzu and Confucius. On the primary premise, if I'm remembering correctly, that those philosophies do not touch upon the karmic principle or like past, present, and future karmic consequences. And this was the undoing of these sort of belief systems. And I'm summarizing, or maybe I'm putting in my own conjecture in there. And so I was curious what either of you thought about the relationship between karma Buddhism and the Tao, as well as the historical timeline of karma as a concept.
In Confucianism, thrown in for good measure.
Right.
Wow,
so those are my questions.
Okay, well, I don't think we've got 15 minutes left. We had to, I think we could be talking about this till doomsday. Yeah, that's a very interesting question. And, Lao Tzu, you can read the Tao Te Ching and karma is never mentioned once. And even, karmic principles aren't. But I think that, the information that, obviously a lot of Buddhist principles were present in Japan before he went to China. And where those came from, we're not going to be able to say for sure, whether they came, what most people think is they went from China through Korea into Japan. But it's entirely possible that there was Indian influences that history doesn't know much about. But yeah, you're right. The Taoists and Confucianism, Confucianism wasn't theology. It was social practices to provide a cohesive society. So there's really no theology there. And I think a lot of what Lao Tzu was poetry for the sake of poetry. It was art for the sake of art. So once again, you've got different purposes in the writing and different purposes in the teaching. And then, you've got to ask, the basic question is, what do we think karma is? And how are we going to define karma? And I think if you look at it in its most open-ended way to define it, that, you're by process of your actions, you're going to get stuck living the life that you created. And you're going to have to contend with that fallout and those effects. I would disagree with Dogen there. I think that in some of the Taoist writings, it covers that pretty well. But, they don't use the term karma. They don't discuss it in a way that I think, Dogen expected it to be. So I would say that critique may hold some water and it may not hold any.
If I remember the context of that fascicle correctly, the context was that a lot of teachers at that time were equating the teachings of Zen or Buddhism with Confucianism and with Taoism. And so what he was probably criticizing were those current teachers of his time. And he would be prone to contextualize Taoism and Confucianism in China as being very different from propounding the idea that they're the same as Zen in Japan in the 13th century. Toward the end of the Sensing Ming, which we quoted earlier, he says, children obey their parents, ministers serve their lords, children obey their parents. Not obeying is not filial. Failure to serve is no help. And then he goes on to say, with practice hidden, functions secretly like a fool, like an idiot. Just to continue in this way is called the host within the host. So he's showing the sort of personal dimension of Buddhist practice as being the central focus. The host within the host is the most intimate, the most personal. And nobody may know you're a Buddhist, or you don't make a public case of it. The children obey their parents, ministers serve their lords, and so forth. It's just saying, yeah, like Matsuoka said, the Zen person has no trouble following the sidewalk. It's just not relevant to, what our practice, the deeper import of our practice. And unfortunately, I think some American Zen lineages have sort of gone off the cliff in that end. It's all about Sangha practice, about being a better person, about engaging in causes and so forth in public. And I'm afraid we're kind of losing it, in the social sphere, the public sphere.
Thank you all both for your input.
Thank you.
Passing along to the rest of the Zoom Sangha.
We've got Buddy Corbin, and we've got Corolla, who are remaining mum. And we've got Ungan. Ungan, he don't say nothing. Ungan, he lay low.
Ungan has a hand up.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Ungan.
Yeah, my first Dharma name was Cinco, which means hidden practice. Couple of quick comments about, thank you very much for your talk this morning. If anybody's really interested in pursuing Taoism and its effect on Buddhism, there's this wonderful book called The Golden Age of Zen, and it has 5 of the Tang Dynasty Zen masters, and it goes into some detail about the relationship with them and their Taoist views and how it merged in with Buddhist views. Anyway, it's a great book if you're interested in pursuing Taoism. Secondly, you were talking about difficulties in translations, and that's something I harp on all the time with the folks I deal with, trying to nitpick what this sutra said or what this person said. In Okumura's Mountains and Waters Sutra, his book, in the introduction, he talks at some length about his personal problems in translating from Chinese to Japanese to American, which I've read just very recently, and it's really a good presentation to show you just how difficult it is to go from Japanese to American. And here's a guy that's, lived both places a pretty long time. Anyway, again, thank you for your time and have a good rest of the day.
You too.
So I see Buddy's hand up. Did you want to respond to that?
No, it's a good comment.
See Buddy's hand up. I'm helping out a little bit. I'm not sure you can see from over there. And I was just going to plug your Thursday night group, Buddy.
Thank you. I'm busy painting today, so I was mostly just listening. Really enjoyed the conversation on emptiness, and I would also second the book that Ungan Bill was talking about. I just finished that book not long ago, and it gave a lot of good history and insight that I really enjoyed.
Good.
I also think Taoism is and I'm not a Taoist scholar by no means. I've just studied the Tao Te Ching for a number of years. It is a good transition for Christians too, because a lot of people aren't aware, but China was a Christian nation for a number of centuries, from like 600 to a little over 1,000 AD. The Jesus Sutras go into that. And it was very easy for China to take on Christianity because they already believed in one force, one source behind everything. So it's a good transition for if someone's looking for some way to come between the two. That for me was really good. And I did not see, I noticed that too, Taylor, that there was no karma in what I read in Taoist philosophy. And what I realized was, I think the way it's put in one of the verses of Tao Te Ching is that the Tao does not take sides, but it's always on the side of the one that forgives. So it's like, I don't say karma, but if you do the right thing, I'm there with you. So it's that kind of an idea for me. So I've really enjoyed the conversation this morning. Thanks, guys.
Good. Glad you were here.
Why don't you plug your group, Buddy? Tell them when to join if they want to join.
Yeah, do a podcast. It's called The Tao of Our Understanding. It's a recovery podcast, but it's out on all. We record every Thursday afternoon. So if that's something that would interest you, the links are in the podcast notes. If you find the podcast on any of the aggregators, you'll see the links there. And you guys are always welcome to join us. We record every Thursday at 4 p.m.
And I join once a month. Is it the third Thursday that I join, I think?
I think you're the first Thursday since
First Thursday. Yep, first Thursday.
Right. And then we discuss a chapter of the a verse of the Tao Te Ching with you on the first Thursday, and then we discuss other literature and some verses of the Tao on those other weeks. So anyone that's interested, you're welcome to join us. Thanks, Sensei.
Thank you.
Thank you, buddy. We have about 6-ish minutes left. Does anybody have any final and parting comments or questions before we close out? Give it a round of silence. All right.
Thanks for being here. We'll conclude with the closing verse.
All right. Thank you, everybody, for coming. I forget all April's shtick, but we're a 501c3 if you so like, you know, Donna's a thing, we have regular programming, it's all on the website.
Donna's a thing. I like that.
Donna's a thing. I love it. Yeah.
Yeah, I see y'all every week. Y'all are good people.
Yeah.
Thank y'all for showing up. Amazing stuff today.